During the 1930s, segregation was a brutal fact of life. Because of the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling of 1896, separate but equal was constitutionally allowed. At the time, racial segregation remained the rule in the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as much of the country. Much of the military believed black soldiers were inferior to whites and couldn't perform as well as white cadets could. At the time, World War II was taking place, giving the Tuskegee Airmen a chance to prove they were just as capable as any American citizen. As the Army Air Corps began ramping up its training program, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier joined civil rights groups like the NAACP in arguing that the black Americans should be included. Many African American organizations pressured the government to allow African Americans to have the same rights and opportunities. Franklin D. Roosevelt promised schools, libraries, and houses for African American communities, and on January 16, 1941, he announced that an all-black pursuit squadron would be trained at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama.
Because my dad was an African American, black guy, he didn't have the opportunities that whites had, he and his friends. But they heard about this program in Tuskegee, Alabama, and they thought it'd be interesting if they could be a part of that. And so my father and his friends joined the cadet program down in Tuskegee.
The first class of airmen had 5 of 13 men graduate and earn their wings from the Tuskegee Institute on March 19, 1941. The 5 airmen who graduated were Benjamin O. Davis Jr., George S. Roberts, Charles B. Brown Jr., Lemuel Custis, and Mac Ross. The program's trainees, nearly all of whom college graduates or undergraduates, came from all over the country. In addition to some 1,000 pilots, the Tuskegee program trained nearly 15,000 navigators, bombardiers, instructors, aircraft and engine mechanics, control tower operators, and other maintenance and support staff. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee in March of 1941 to observe their civilian pilot training program. Mrs. Roosevelt requested an orientation flight. She was taken up for a view of the training area by Tuskegee Institute's chief instructor, Pilot Charles Anderson. Mrs. Roosevelt's visit was prior to the final construction of Moton Field, so the flight actually took off from Kennedy Field. As a trustee to the Rosenwald Fund, her experience helped secure the financing needed for the final construction of Moton Field. Eleanor Roosevelt's visit marked the activation of the first all-African American military unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Her visit spread word and raised awareness of Negro flying. In September of 1943, Colonel Davis Jr. was sent to the Rumetilli Airfield to take command of the 332nd. Before his arrival to Rumetilli, there was an attempt to stop the use of black pilots in the 99th in combat. Senior officers filed false reports. These false reports consist of opinions that the 99th should be removed from combat due to lack of aggressive behavior towards the enemy and poor performance in the field. Davis was furious at the remarks and demanded he have the chance to defend his men. He argued how in white squadrons men rotate after a 5-month period, while his men have no rotation. He also argued that the only reason they lack aggressive combat was because they were placed farthest from the war and barely ever had any enemy encounters. Marshall ordered an inquiry on the 99th but allowed them to keep flying in the meantime. Eventually, the inquiry came back showing that the 99th performance was just as well as the other airmen.
Really enjoyed the experiences they had with all the people they met in all the various villages they went from in Italy, especially in Italy. And also in West Africa, they made a lot of good friendships there too.
Rather than being shipped home, the 99th was moved to Italy and based at Rumetilli Airfield along with the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd Fighter Squadrons in February of 1944. These squadrons of black pilots and other personnel made up the new 332nd Fighter Group. After this transfer, the pilots of the 332nd began flying P-51 Mustangs to escort the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force during raids into the deep enemy territory.
During their stay in Italy, when they were really exhilarated at the fact that they could walk freely among a predominantly white culture and be accepted there, and also people didn't seem to be biased there, and it was their first actual experience of being with people who sincerely didn't have any color barriers.
The tails of their planes were painted red for identification purposes, earning them the enduring nickname Red Tails. The same year, pilots from the 99th shot down 12 German fighters in 2 days while protecting the Anzio beachhead, proving themselves in combat.
They knew the jets were faster, but they weren't quite as maneuverable as the P-51 was. And plus, I think the airmen were better pilots.
Fighting in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Then on August 14th of the same year, fighting in Japan ended. The airmen were sent home only to see their status had not changed despite their achievements made in World War II. When they stepped off the ship, they were greeted with a quick whites to the right and Negroes to the left. This infuriated many of the African Americans who had risked their lives for a country that would only see them for the color of their skin. Many of the airmen had a hard time finding jobs because of Jim Crow laws. Despite all the racism, some African Americans continued service in the military. The 332nd Fighter Squadron's diligence and dedication towards the war inspired Harry S. Truman to issue Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, 3 years after the war. The order abolished discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in the United States Armed Forces, which eventually led to the end of segregation in the services. The Tuskegee units flew 1,578 combat missions, of which 179 were bomber escorts with only 25 bombers lost to the war effort, fewest compared to any other unit. These accomplishments earned the unit 3 Distinguished Unit Citations and 1 Congressional Gold Medal. Individually, 744 Air Medals, 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 8 Purple Hearts, and 14 Bronze Stars were earned. In addition, 4 Tuskegee Airmen rose to the rank of General Officer: General Chappie James, General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., Brigadier General Noel Parrish, and Brigadier General Charles McGee.
I would say they were probably the first real movement on the modern civil rights era. What they started showing that with the same amount of training anybody could accomplish as good a job as anybody else. 1925 Army War College study had said that African Americans weren't smart enough or brave enough. And this is despite the fact that there have been African Americans that have flown and fought for other countries like France and Ethiopia. You had African Americans that had fought in every war in the United States had ever been in, even before there was the United States.
I feel the theme Breaking Barriers fits perfectly in regard to the Tuskegee Airmen because they broke multiple barriers. They not only broke through military barriers, but also broke through racial, gender, and capability barriers. I feel this point in history is important because it influenced President Truman to issue Executive Order 9981. I also feel these historic actions throughout the war encouraged Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to publicly protest for equal rights on behalf of African Americans among the civilian community.
The Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny.
I will say that they went through so many hard times. Number one, they proved that if given the opportunity, they could do just as well as their white peers. And number two, one of the things that was really, really good to know is that they established the value that never quit, use your brain, expect to win, be ready to go. All these values that we try to incorporate into the CF Red Tail Squadron program. And they're just universal values. And I think that the men and women who were part of that program did such a fabulous job that we're still talking about them.